Okay, hi everyone. So today we have Kenneth J. Saltman, who is a professor of educational policy studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Ken has written extensively on neoliberal privatization, politics of education, culture, and subjectivity in education, all through critical theory and also drawing from critical educational traditions. Today, he's here to talk with us about his new book, The Alienation of Fact, Digital Educational Privatization, AI, and the False Promise of Bodies and Numbers, which is out now on MIT Press. So welcome, Ken. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Alex. Good to be with you.
So actually, we wanted to start off talking about your book and maybe starting with the title and getting into that. So what exactly would you say is alienation of fact? And added to that, can you tell us what exactly that means for you and how this book emerged?
Sure. So what I noticed at the outset of writing this book was that there was this seemingly glaring contradiction that I kept seeing in a lot of seemingly disparate places about facts. On the one hand, in education, in a number of other domains, policing, increasingly in the humanities, facts were supposed to come from nowhere, be data, and many things were increasingly supposed to be data-driven. So we hear this rhetoric in education all the time. Teaching ought to be data-driven, administration ought to be data-driven. So I was curious with how this emphasis on fact as decontextualized data related to what seemed to be increasing as a kind of emphasis, particularly in political discourse, of framing facts as no longer needing arguments, evidence, theoretical justifications. Obviously, Donald Trump is a glaring example of this. Politicians making assertions without having to justify or back the assertions. So I began thinking about, how do we make sense of this contradiction? And so the book and this term is an attempt to reconcile the contradiction. And probably the two ideas that are most central to understanding this are the way both phenomena relate to positivism, positivist ideology, which is a long-standing ideology which goes back to the founding of sociology itself as a discipline. The idea that truth is a world of facts, that facts can stand on their own, that don't need to be undergirded by their contexts, values, assumptions, and ideologies that animate and give meaning to facts in social contexts don't need to be necessarily unpacked. And we see this playing out in education historically. Positivist ideology played a big role in the so-called hidden curriculum of the industrial era of capitalism, when schools were supposed to reproduce the labor force, in part by teaching not just skills for work, but also the dispositions, relationships to other people that would give people a prescribed place in the workforce. And the ideology of positivism can be found, for example, in standardized testing, in the way that knowledge is represented as coming from nowhere, coming without the subjective the social positions and subjective interests and ideologies behind the claims to truth that people make. So, for example, really obvious example here, on a standardized test, the student never gets to enter into a dialogue with the person who made the test, ask questions about why did this end up on the test as opposed to something else? How is it that these 4 things or 5 things become the only possibility of knowing and understanding. And so the relations, the social relationships, the subjectivities that undergird the truth claim disappear. They get erased. And we're seeing in more recent versions of schooling new expressions of positivism, including well, the digitalization of testing, the transformation of testing into curriculum itself, for example, with personalized learning. And I talk in the book about how this logic of positivism, the ideology of positivism, is found not just in education, where truth gets translated into numbers and test scores, but it's also in policing, where CompStat becomes a way of measuring police outcomes through statistics, or we see it now we're seeing it in the humanities, where texts get subjected to data analytics. And so we're seeing this all over the place. Another basic idea that underlies the alienation of fact is the idea of anti-essentialism. And so one of the things I was noticing that's very much in this book is a recognition that more and this is in the title, more and more numbers are standing in for truth, as I just discussed, but so are bodies in a lot of different domains. And so the various chapters of the book go through and give examples of how a kind of false guarantee of truth found in numbers and bodies actually undermines and misrepresents people's capacity to understand what's being done, how society works. And so some of these examples include the OECD and the Lego group are attempting to make play into a quantified measure, and turn children's play into something that can be captured as data. It can be measured. It can be crunched through algorithms. And so I talk about, for example, what are the interests in doing something like this? Lego is the largest toy maker on the planet, and they make little plastic blocks we've all played with, but they also make, increasingly, they're making digital apps, and they're increasingly having these two things come together so that children's play and behavior and affect can be captured as data and measured by the apps. And why would they care about turning this into a global learning standard? Well, if they can make it into, they can make children's behavior and affect into something that has to be measured, is linked to knowledge and learning itself, then their product then becomes something that is a global necessity for the world to buy. So we see these kinds of things in the book, in other examples. Wildflower, Montessori school puts biometric sensors on toddlers and measures their movement. We see the Gates Foundation conducted biometric measurement studies based on market research. And so there are a number of examples throughout the book, including conspiracy theory. So the Alienation of Fact does a little bit of work in trying to understand how is it that, drunk uncle at Thanksgiving is falling prey to QAnon as opposed to not, why are, what seems to many people to be such outlandish conspiracy theories having such explanatory purchase. And one of the answers that the book gives is that they provide a kind of bad social theory that's grounded in the inflated agency of certain groups and strongman figures, and that rather than the kinds of social explanations that situate facts in terms of social context, social tendencies, structures of power, the relationship between those structures of power and individual subjectivity and agency. Instead, what conspiracy theory gives is a kind of easy, emotionally potent explanation in which inflated agency of individuals or maligned groups can be the explanation for social phenomena. And so it's an example in which the body, particular bodies, come to have explanatory power.
So on one hand, the alienation of fact is describing this like deep contradiction that we see, which is a kind of exaltation, or maybe it's not exaltation even, it's you talk about material and symbolic precarity driving a desire for certainty in a world that has been made radically uncertain and insecure. And numbers, data and numbers seem to provide something certain. They seem to provide accurate measurements of objective reality, which, you know, are construed as facts. But what you're saying is that they're reified. It's obscured. They obscure the actual social relations that are producing the world around us. So it's a false sense of certainty. But you have this you have this sort of fetishization of numbers and data and statistics simultaneously with the rise of conspiracy theory, total irrationalism, totally zany, insane explanations for what, Jewish space lasers and
pedophile pizza shops
that comes out of airplanes, and that, like all of these or much more insidious conspiracies like Great Replacement theory and white nationalist ideology, white Christian ideology, etc. So these things seem to be in contradiction, but really what you're saying is that they're emerging out of shared social foundations, and you describe the educational foundations.
That's right.
I'm wondering, so since neoliberalism and digitalization really become the way you help explain or part of the explanation for why we have this contradiction today, could you go into a little more detail about the role neoliberalism and digitalization in producing this contradiction.
And thank you for unpacking that. So what the theorist I rely on very heavily throughout the book is Theodor Adorno, and Adorno pointed out that this idea about how there's a kind of false promise and a false certainty in numbers is in Adorno. It comes from Adorno, and Adorno emphasized that in a world in which, in capitalism, in which everything gets translated into economic exchange value, everything is experienced as abstract and demands a kind of concreteness, and that numbers provide this kind of allure of certainty. Quantification provides this. And one of the things I point out in the book is that we can add to Adorno's insight that datafication does something very similar, that when we're experiencing the world, not just with everything mediated through financial exchange, but also everything mediated, including our conversation right here, everything mediated digitally, something happens, right? The world gets experienced in an abstract way. And so part of the argument here is that what is driving this promise of certainty is a kind of worsening of what Adorno identified with abstraction. And so in terms of neoliberalism, I mean, my whole career has been, I've been writing about the neoliberal restructuring of education from different angles. So the privatization of public schools, the corporatization, managerialism, consumerism applied to parents and students, capitalist language and logic framing school reform debates, stupid metaphors like stock portfolios orienting education policy reforms like urban portfolio districts, on and on and on. It's kind of endless. And I've looked at this from the vantage point of the body and the global and in terms of school policy. And so part of what this book and other books, a couple of books before it, a book since this one, are looking at is the way that increasingly the privatization of public schooling is going digital. It's increasingly taking digital forms. And at the same time, the kind of longer standing forms of educational privatization, charters, vouchers, those are actually continuing to expand. And yet at the same time, digital forms of privatization are a kind of insidious colonization of the life world. They're an attempt to transform subjectivity and interiority consciousness into new markets, and they're a form of accumulation by dispossession or militarized accumulation, whatever you want to call it. But they represent a kind of radicality, a breaking up to create new market possibilities. And so I guess, you know, to bring it back to what I was saying about Adorno and your question, Alex, you know, what part of what the expansion of markets into education represents is an expansion of the logic of abstraction taken to new domains, and both in terms of you know, putting markets everywhere and now increasingly digitalizing everywhere. So you see this, for example, with an app that's in 85% of American classrooms now called Class Dojo, where it's a kind of digital surveillance, data capture, social media app that uses little entertaining characters that look oddly like green condoms, and the data that gets you got to look at the data that gets captured when students and teachers use the app in classrooms is then used to market pay-for-fee services to parents. And those pay-for-fee services relate to another part that the book deals with. And those are services in mindfulness and resilience and growth mindset. And so these are sort of new agey, self-help programs, much of which, many of these programs are about having students turn their focus and towards their own feelings, delinked from the social world that produces those feelings. And this is something, Alex, in your book, Schooling in the Age of Austerity, you wrote about in the Chicago context with the calm classroom example. Resilience discourse, mindfulness, meditation, growth mindset, including more behaviorist ones like biometric pedagogy. These things are becoming more and more, as the book points out, the content that can be sold through the new digital forms of educational privatization. So those are just a couple of examples. And what's interesting to me, as I talk about in this book, is and a more recent book on the disaster of resilience, is that the same key players of longstanding educational privatization, such as, for example, the New School Venture Fund and John Doerr, who's a billionaire tech investor who got into investing in charter school startups, he pivoted and began investing heavily in digital educational privatization for profits as well as nonprofits. So, for example, Amira Learning and Center of Invention ZooU and Class Dojo. There are, you know, many examples of these for-profit companies that have been are looking to profiteer and privatize and capture student data and commercialize it, capture and commercialize student bodies, being done by very many of the same people who were at the center of longstanding privatizations. In Chicago, the head of Chicago's Renaissance schools started Leap Innovations, which is a personalized learning that's does similar things.
So, one, I guess I would like to hear you just follow up a little bit on the question of, like, say, mindfulness or resilience. I think a lot of people would hear those terms. I mean, maybe people who are tuning into this particular program are already kind of hip to the, you know, critiques of resilience and mindfulness. But I just want to point out, like, in the book, you don't take some sort of like anti-technology line. This isn't about critiquing technology in and of itself, nor is it critiquing things like meditation or mindfulness. It's that these profit oriented apps and platforms, it goes back to that question of abstraction that you were talking about. They're not teaching kids to understand their feelings in terms of, like, what Raymond Williams talks about, that there's a structure of feeling in the society, that our actual embodied life is connected to the historical forces in which we're engaged, you know, that confront us and the conditions in which we live. All of those things are sort of erased, and it's just this total surface. It's just the world appears to you, you feel it, but there's no way of apprehending the underlying foundations that are producing the reality that you're encountering. So maybe just to get you to talk a little bit about you know, your kind of what you think about that in general, but also just your kind of attitude toward technology and relation dialectically, like, you know, these malign applications, but also applications that wouldn't have to take these kinds of forms.
Yeah, that's right. So with the first part, with these resilience projects, yeah, I mean, I think you said it very well. So what this book and the next book are dealing with very much are the ways that these programs, under a guise of being attentive to student subjectivity and feelings, actually undermine the capacities of students to make sense of what it is that produces those feelings. So, for example, one of the easy ones is the meditation programs. They encourage students to who may be experiencing the stress, violence, psychological despair of racialized poverty in the context that they're living in. And they go into their urban public school and they are told, don't think about what you're feeling, how it relates to what you might be experiencing outside the school and what's producing those social realities. Instead, they're being told, turn inward, focus on your feelings. Your feelings become the start and finish of understanding your feelings. In other words, it's a kind of prohibition on understanding one's feelings under a kind of branding of self-understanding. So it's anti-dialectical in a profound way. And I think that's harmful and dangerous, because part of what it does is it institutionalizes ways of learning that de-link knowledge from understanding the social conditions that produce the knowledge, that de-link the self from understanding the way society produces the self and the way the self in turn produces society. And instead, And it makes it impossible for students to, or very difficult for students to relate what's going on in school to how an understanding can, in school, can help them understanding the broader world. How can they, and then have, agency, in the sense that Henry Giroux talks about it, and to have knowledge and understanding be the source of collective social action to do something about the problems that one experiences outside of school. And so it's not just meditation programs that do this, mindfulness programs do this, or like something like personalized learning purports to be personalized when in fact it has almost all of these programs have no relationship between the content that is being, so-called delivered in the programs and the social context of the student's experiences, the student's culture, the student's language. No, it's under a rubric of personalization. They're radically anti-personal, and so this doesn't have to be this way. I think they need to be understood as profoundly ideological programs, and they're inevitably misrepresented as beyond ideology. And so one of the things these books deal with is the fact that they get grounded very often through biological tropes. So for example, a really big one is through the trope of trauma. And people in human capital theory, Gary Becker, write about this sort of stuff. And they suggest that so the poverty in the social context results in the student having high, they call it allostatic load. So it's like embodied stress. And then this high allostatic load causes them the experience of stress and physical maladies. And so they need resilience pedagogies that can help unblock the blockages that could get produced through this physiological trauma, and this will allow them to become good empty receptacles for transmission pedagogies that can dump knowledge into them. Right? So it's what I talk about is very much this biological false foundation of resilience pedagogies is really an adjunct to stupid old transmission models of pedagogy that, as we know, are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and they're models of learning that are based in consumption and that are also positivist, that de-link the knowledge that's being taught from the people and social conditions informing the production of that knowledge. With regard to the other question about Ludditism and technophobia, so one of the chapters in the Alienation of Fact, the AI chapter, gives an example of the opposite of some of what I'm describing here. It talks about, it's not an education project, it's actually an art project put together by Forensic Architecture called Triple Chaser. You can go on Forensic Architecture's website and look at this yourself. There's a video that you can watch that details and explains the project. What the project did is it was an exhibit in the Whitney Museum in New York City during the Whitney Biennale, and it was a project in which the members of this group supplied people with around the world with technology to take images and provide these images of tear gas canisters and that had been used on the population by police and military. So this is in various places in the US, in Mexico, in the occupied territories, done by the IDF, multiple examples. And when they captured these images and ran them through an algorithm. They used the algorithm to identify the found objects, and found that almost invariably these objects were produced by a single company. The company was a company called Safariland, which is an arms dealer. And it happened that Safariland is owned by a person named Warren Kanders. Warren Kanders happened to be the chairman of the board of the Whitney Museum. And so there was an activist organization called, I think it's called Decolonize This Place. And the forensic architecture group worked in conjunction with that activism to highlight Kanders' role in war profiteering and role in the use of these weapons of war against civilian populations all over the world. And so Kanders ultimately was forced to resign from his position as chair of the board of the museum. But more significantly, what the project did is it showed how some AI technology can be used to actually reconnect objects used in state violence and corporate state violence to understand their conditions of production, distribution, to understand and identify people who are often hidden agents and beneficiaries of this kind of state corporate violence. And so I talk about it in the book in order to highlight that there are, in fact, radical possibilities in using some of the same technology, which oftentimes is used, for example, with mirror learning, for scripted reading instruction in ways that are radically anti-dialogical. They're really about undermining forms of learning reading that are holistic, that are about understanding context, that involve dialogue about what one's reading, or other uses of the technology. So yeah, so I rather than, there are some people who say, you know, the answer is to dump the technologies, as opposed to, you know, those critical scholars and activists among us have the possibility of taking these technologies and not simply using the existing technologies in critical ways, but actually developing new technologies that can actually help people understand the relationships between subjectivity and social context, to situate objects and objects of knowledge, to develop critical consciousness.
And yeah, so that example that you give in the book with forensic architecture, how you just said it really represents a critical and creative way of engaging with technology and AI so that it remains connected within, right, the social and cultural context in which these technologies emerge, which then is in tension with these ideas of resilience, grit, technology, mindfulness, and those examples that we have with feeling, where it's trying to control emotions, trying to control bodies, and disconnect them from the very social connections that we have. And actually, how we said, feelings are social, they are cultural, that's where they emerge. But what it's doing is, it's almost how it came back to saying, it's making something that's very abstract, feelings and emotions and bodies, and compartmentalizing them and individualizing them. So then that is able to get that data to then create those markets. And with this idea of quantification, and narrowing this abstraction and creativity of what feelings and bodies are, you mentioned this earlier with play. And I think that chapter with Lego and play is actually really interesting, because it also is seeking to quantify something that is really a social activity. It's hard to really define play, because, you know, at some point, how we have people saying play is actually very improvisational, right? It's hard to predict play. It's you let children, go into a playground and make up stories, And that's not something you can say, okay, well, here in this lesson plan, you're going to go to the playground, you're going to play this makeup story. So it's not prescriptive and instrumentalized, like as it's being promoted by these supranational organizations and corporations, like you say in that chapter. So with that, I'm curious for you in going through researching all of this, at what point do you think that play stops being play?
When does play stop being play?
Yeah, because I think we see that with the quantification of play and how they're almost redefining play for in a different sense. And would
Yeah,
we even say it's accurate to call what they're doing a play-based?
yeah. Well, yeah. So I guess one of the things that a lot of these I sifted through a lot of the reports that the Lego Foundation's the nonprofit wing of the Lego Corporation, and they're churning out all these reports about why there needs to be more play-based learning, and why, we should get on board with play-based learning being, something that's quantified. So one of the things that's interesting is a lot of it seems to be at odds with play as creative, open-ended, and oriented around imagination, and more in line with say what Lego I don't know if you've noticed, there's a difference between Lego blocks from decades ago and how Lego blocks are now sold. Lego blocks, when I was a kid, I would play with Lego blocks. You'd get a bag and there'd be a bunch of blocks in it, and you would put them together. You would imagine things and you would make them. Almost all Lego products that are the plastic blocks, they're recipes. They're prescribed, and the idea is that someone else imagined the thing, and you are supposed to follow the recipe, right? So there's a little bit of a problem in this prescription, but there's something else going on here, and that is that a heck of a lot of these prescribed things that are imagined are actually part of Lego's mass media tie-in commercialism. So they're tied into many media conglomerates. And so a lot of what they're doing is they're cross-promoting movies and other toys, and then and increasingly these media products. And so it's not just that creativity and imagination are being kind of displaced by recipes, it's that they're being displaced by recipes, and these recipes are to make essentially advertisements for things that have their own already made narratives and stories, like films and video games and things like this. So that's part of what I think is at stake here. But there's something else going on that when I looked at the Lego literature, and that is that Lego Foundation appropriates the language of critical and progressive education in talking about all this stuff. So they talk about agency, and they're not talking about a student having the capacity to understand something to then be able to act on and shape the social world with others. That's not what they mean by agency. When they talk about agency, they talk about a very narrow, limited notion of classroom teaching. So agency is never about anything beyond the classroom setting, for example. And so they redefine a key critical term into something diametrically opposed to what it actually means. And they do this with a number of other terms, praxis, reflective action, and so that and actually researching Lego, and then later researching Leap Innovations and Musical Venture Fund, I started seeing a pattern that this kind of business appropriation of critical and progressive language is now becoming very widespread. troubling. So I guess, and it begs the question of, what's the response for people who actually are operating out of critical and progressive education traditions? Does it mean that we actually need new language? Are these terms becoming compromised and emptied out of their meaning by virtue of their use in this way?
No, I mean, that's the question. I'm glad you said that, because it's one of those that I think personally, I always have the question, how do you get the language and the stuff that you're doing, like agency with play and all of that? How you just ask, how do you avoid for that being appropriated into the language of, marketization, and where it's having a recipe to create the correct Lego or block form. It's just, how well can you take directions, right? And that has very good going forward, capitalism would very much like the worker to be able to take directions without passively and ironically without the agency that they claim to want to produce and encourage.
Yeah. Well, Amy, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of like one of the themes that appears over and over in these examples that the book sifts through is that so many of them are about creating obedience to authority in students as opposed to critical thought and critical engagement with the world they inhabit. And that's a big piece of what's at stake in the criticism and in the need for more criticism of the new forms of digital privatization, as well as of the ongoing forms.
I want to follow up here with a question on identity politics. I mean, part of some of what's being described here, not just in the play example, but in the prior discussion that we've had too, is a kind of radical individualization and psychologization of social problems.
Yeah.
And I think that we also see that in not only in sort of neoliberal ideology and how that's, corporate technology culture, et cetera, but also in liberal and progressive politics, or at least certain strands of liberal and progressive politics. And I think, you have a chapter in the book where you provide a specific kind of critique of identity politics, which again is really, you had mentioned this previously about essentialism and anti-essentialism being a key part of this book, and also just your thinking in general. So I wonder if you could give us some of the outlines of how this critique of identity politics and some of the arguments that you make about sort of liberal and progressive ideologies mirror, and replicate like these other corporate and neoliberal ideologies in many ways.
I think it's the last chapter. It deals with this, and it's it's part of the title that's about the false promise of bodies. And so, for example, despite the fact that many theorists like Stuart Hall, for example, theorize race as a social construction, there are more and more people across the political spectrum who are now understanding race through essentialism. And so I revisit some of the arguments from the 90s in these debates to foreground the conversation. But on the political right, you have of course, resurgent white supremacy, which says that the nature and truth of people is found in their biology, and certain strands of identity politics on the left, you get the idea that whiteness, rather than being a social construction, is inherently a guilty, culpable subject position, not subject to being re-articulated through anti-racist politics and a multiracial alliance, for example. And so the chapter's dealing with contemporary manifestations of the kind of resurging essentialism, white supremacy on the right, and some examples that they're in the title of the chapter: virtue signaling, affinity groups, safe spaces. That part of the argument here is that in the new framings of difference, it becomes very difficult for people to take up emancipatory politics in ways that are in public spaces, and that increasingly the way that difference can be taken up, race, gender, sexuality, is through only the privatized spaces, safe space on the campus, as opposed to the idea that the whole campus is a public space. It's a contested terrain. It needs to be a space where people can actually assert emancipatory values and ideologies. And so the chapter is very much a call for people to get back to the kinds of anti-essentialist politics that allow them in part to have, for example, anti-racist, anti-sexist pedagogies, and that they can work to remake social identities in ways that different groups struggling against domination can be linked together and part of a bigger project for a more radically democratic society. So I'm very troubled by the return of essentialisms, and how it's working across the political spectrum, and it's positioning people to take positions in which reifying identity categories becomes seen as necessary for doing good politics.
The question that we want to ask is really about this emancipatory politics that you're talking about, and this possibility for a more radically democratic society. As you've written all these books over the last 2 decades, I mean, going on more than 2 decades now that you've been publishing your work, how has the situation changed? I mean, what are the fundamental challenges that we're dealing with now, both in terms of education, and also the broader society in terms of the democratic struggles, that the possibility for, as you say, a more radically democratic society? Like, how are you conceptualizing this point that we're at now, and how we might move forward to something better? Yeah.
Well, some of the most dramatic changes we talked about, how some of the things that had, been really marginal have become mainstream, like certain strains of constructivism. Some of the new challenges include the fact that anti-theory has taken such a prominent role in inside and outside of higher education, and the theoretical traditions that people were steeped in the past seem to be disappearing, while whole disciplines are coming under attack through the neoliberalization of higher education, right? So humanities disciplines, critical social science traditions are coming under attack. And in a way, I mean, these are the disciplines through which a society is self-reflective and kind of has a conscience. And so I think I see this as a big danger, and a big necessity for, and it's, in a way, it's related to the need for activism and social movements to increasingly go in a more theoretical direction and embrace theory. Another massive change in the past decades, of course, is the advent of social media and the shift to digitalization, which has resulted in a kind of domination of vapid, ungrounded opinion from the internet, which we witnessed this with students, and a kind of leveling in which the source of there's a crisis of critical literacies, in the sense that more and more students, people, are unable to discern the quality of the source of information, whether it's been worked through some sort of editorial process, whether it's an academic editorial process, a journalistic editorial process, and a kind of assertion ends up being framed as equivalent to anything else. And so that's a kind of educational crisis that demands teaching students to be able to discern the differences in quality of assertion. And so as the book is getting at, part of what that involves is not just more facts and better facts, but helping students develop the tools to understand the values and assumptions and ideologies that undergird facts and make facts meaningful. And that's related to the need for more and better forms of literacy, and not just print literacy, but other kinds of literacy as well, media literacies. So those are some of the big ones. Some of the more hopeful things that obviously happened is the increasing visibility of class politics, and in ways that are kind of surprising, like the fact that now you can have politicians openly talking about class and socialism, and you can have Nancy Fraser, defining herself as a Marxist on NPR. I mean, never thought I'd see that one coming. But the fact that class has now come to the fore in such an open way is actually a very hopeful political development that needs to be cultivated and appreciated. Not to end on too dour a note.
That's great. Well, Ken, this has been a pleasure to talk to you today. So thank you for coming on and joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Hopefully we get to do it again sometime. All right.